Hi, I've been giving a lot of presentations recently on how to get started with SLOs, kind of like in a 60-minute workshop. I want to expand a little bit about this and focus it also on Dynatrace. So this is why this observability clinic is called Explain, Define, Implement, and Scale SLOs. And if you follow me, I think everybody can really get started with their SLO journey in 60 minutes or less. This is part of the Cloud Automation Unlimited seasons, a lot of other content, and I also have particular links later on to other material in case you're interested in going deeper into some of these aspects. But let's get started. What are you going to learn today? As I said, I want to explain why SLOs are important, because I think if you cannot explain why it's important, it's really hard for you to convince your organization or your teams to adopt it. The next thing is, how do we define SLOs? Because if you don't know the right questions to ask, you will struggle like many others do. The next thing is how to implement SLOs. I will show you how to set up your SLIs, SLOs, error budgets, dashboards, and alerting using Dynatrace. And then we talk about scaling SLOs, because if you don't shift left, if you don't use SLOs as part of your kind of development lifecycle, I think you will miss a great opportunity in really unleashing the power of SLOs across the lifecycle. So first of all, why SLOs? And I want to start with some examples. SLOs should, and you will hear this later from me, always start from the top. Business SLOs, the business objective of an application or a service. Like you see here, business relevant SLOs, like can people actually log in? Are they able to successfully log into your application that you're hosting? Or things like, can people execute certain actions like successful payments or using a certain feature? And this is what SLOs are great for, to know if your end users or consumers of your services can actually do what you want them to do. But then also SLOs are really great for more the DevOps and SRE folks understanding the so-called 4 golden signals from Google Site Reliability Engineering practices. So how we are delivering our services with an expected response time, how much throughput do we have, what's the failure rate, or what's the processing time. So these are all things SLOs are also great for, to figure out overall if your infrastructure, if your services deliver based on SLOs that you have to the consumer of those services. So top business, but you can also then and should always break it down to more technical metrics. Why are we doing all of this? Because I believe if you're investing in DevOps and SRE and you are aligned with your business objectives, with your SLOs, you have defined SLOs that make sure that you're meeting your business objectives, then you can make better decisions on actually what do you automate in production to ensure reliability, right? I think one of the things I always bring up, if you're flooded with alerts because you have too many alerts going on, if certain disks are slow or if there's a problem with a CPU spike, which one do you want to target first? I think it should be the one that in the end impacts a business objective, and don't hunt every single problem, but focus on those that are relevant. And the same is true for DevOps engineers that are investing in automating delivery. As you're automating delivery, think about how you can bake in checks, quality checks into your pipeline to really make sure that the next build that you deploy is not violating and jeopardizing your business SLOs later on as they go into production. So using SLOs as part of the delivery pipeline. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of understanding on why we need SLOs. We need to be aligned to the business goals. Now, defining SLOs. First of all, we know that it's really hard to define SLOs, even though we've been talking about this, the industry, for many, many years now. But you can see here, this came out of our recent SRE report. A lot of people are struggling with really defining SLOs. Too many data sources to choose from, don't know what makes a good SLO, and so on and so forth. If you want to read the whole report, feel free to download it from our website. So it's not easy. One of the things that I've learned in my kind of time that I've been working on SLOs is that we need to be very clear on what we actually mean with certain things, because right now there's a lot of confusion. So for instance, if you are defining an availability SLO or an SLO depending on error rates, then you need to be very clear of what you actually mean with availability. What is an error for you? Because if you just point it out like this as a term, you may have a different definition of this than somebody else. Also, if you define SLOs and you give it to somebody, you need to make sure that they understand how this is relevant for their work. Also, who is responsible for an SLO, right? What happens if an SLO is breached? Is it just a red dot on the dashboard, or is there some action happening? How do you measure SLOs? If you just come up with something that you want to have as an SLO, but you don't know how to measure it, then you have a problem. And also, what are realistic objectives? Don't just come up with numbers that you think make sense. They have to be realistic, and they have also to be agreed on everyone that owns this SLO. Another tip, start with consumer-focused SLOs. SLOs are not just there to define them and then put them on a feel-good dashboard like you see on the left. If everything is green, then that's great. But if it's red on the outside, if people are actually having errors and customers are complaining, then you're not measuring the right thing. So also great blog post here from Zendesk. This is why you should always start focusing your SLOs first on the consumer experience of your service, of your app, and then break it down into technical metrics, technical SLOs that you can then give to the individual teams. And this brings me to my second tip, what I've also covered extensively in some of the recent conferences like SLO Conf or WTF SRE, running a top-down workshop that includes business DevOps and SRE. So if you really want to start with an SLO journey in your organization, pick an app, pick a critical service, and start asking the business owners, what is the objective of your service? To give you an example, for a mobile app, you may want to have a certain app adoption, meaning how many users should adopt the new app, but you can also do it on a feature. How many users should adopt a new feature until a certain point in time? And in my example here that I brought from one of my personal experiences with one of our users, they had a mobile app, a new mobile app, and their business goal was that by the end of the year, they wanted to have 65% of their total user base on that new app. This is why the metric itself, the SLO, is the ratio of new app daily users versus the total users. But then you want to break down and find a way to break down the top level business goal to something that is more technical. Now, it may take a couple of steps. So for me, when I heard that app adoption is the goal, I was then asking them, what is a leading indicator for better app adoption? And then they told me, well, the app rating, because if you have a good app rating, if people are talking about the app in a good way, then we are probably increasing app adoption. And so we said, great. So that means we need to get a handle on app rating. Where do you want that app rating to be? Where is it right now? Oh, it is let's say at a 2-star or 3-star rating, but we want to get it at a 4.5 star or 4+ stars. That means we need to get to at least 85%, assuming, right? You always have a range. SLOs always defined between 0 and 100%. Another question on this would be, what is a leading indicator for app rating? Why are people not giving a good rating versus a good rating? Well, one of the things that then came out of this particular workshop is that mobile crashes was one of the top reasons people complained about why they didn't like the app. So we said, this is now a great technical metric. The crash rate on officially supported devices has to come down. Maybe you even need to increase the range of officially supported devices, because right now, if you think people are using a certain version of Android or iOS, but your real user monitoring data shows you that people are actually using other devices and other versions that are experiencing crashes because you've never tested for it, then maybe you also need to shift your focus. But these are great metrics now, a technical metric that is a leading indicator for the app rating, that is an indicator, a leading indicator for app adoption. Now, you can monitor all of this, right? The first and the third metric, if you're a Dynatrace user, you know that this comes out of the box with Dynatrace Real User Monitoring. The second metric, the app rating, is something we can pull in from an external data source, like, let's say, the Android or iOS store, because they have an API. That's also what we did. Most important in the end, remember, you need to define ownership. So who owns a particular SLO? What is owned by the business teams? What is owned by the DevOps teams, who can, for instance, automate more testing into the DevOps pipelines for these particular, let's say, mobile devices, or for a particular browser or whatever it is that you are then, what your service is. Now, let's go a step further, because these were kind of more front-end metrics to the end user, to the consumer, but behind every front end, there's also a back end. So we then picked, and you should also pick, your critical backend services, like the authentication service, your shopping cart service, your user service, whatever it is in your application and specify what is important for you. The service has to be available, because if it's not available, people that try to use your application will not be happy, therefore impacting the app rating and the app adoption. So things like the system should be available 99.99% of the time. Response time, a rather critical one, right? We all live in a world where we want to have fast and instant responses. So you want to make sure that you define a goal for critical APIs, for instance, those that support your login. And in this case, in my workshop here, we specified the rate of login requests should be faster than 500 milliseconds, 85% of the time. Now, sometimes it's really hard to come up with those numbers, because it's hard to figure out what is good performance and not good. If you don't have these numbers, well, maybe just look around, look at your competition, what they are doing, right? Look at their website, open up your browser, figure out how long it takes for that app to make that backend service call that authenticates you, for instance. Also, error rate, very important. Your services should not only be available in general, right, meaning responding with a response, but they should also be fast, and they should not be failing under critical conditions. Obviously, certain failures are, you have to account for it, but this is why we're setting, let's say, a goal of smaller than 1%. Then you can define these SLOs and put them on the dashboard and assign owners. SRE and DevOps is what I put here, because for me, the SREs are those that make sure that the systems where all of these services run are resilient, are available, they're properly sized, there's enough compute, enough storage available. So they have definitely a better handle on availability. Error rate and response time, right? That's clearly also something where testing comes in, but it's kind of like an overlap on response time between DevOps responsibility and SRE. But this is something where testing, automated testing as part of a delivery pipeline comes in, and capacity planning, obviously. So to sum it up, run a top-down workshop, come up with a good list of SLOs. In the end, you want to have an owner. Every SLO should be aligned to the top goal. You have to have a clear definition of what it is that this SLO is all about and how to measure it. It has to be a realistic goal that has to be agreed upon with everyone, and then you have to make it visible and tangible. All right, so hopefully this explains now how you can define SLOs. I think it's very important to go from top to bottom. The next thing is, how do you implement SLOs? Now, I do work for Dynatrace. You're watching a Dynatrace Observability Clinic, so you can expect me to show you something, how to do this with Dynatrace. So the first tip that I give you, because a lot of people that I work with, they say, well, we don't really know what to get started with, but they think availability is actually a good metric, but how do you measure availability? And I always say, I really like synthetic tests exactly for that reason, because I can set up a synthetic test that is validating on a scheduled basis, maybe every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes, if your application, if your critical business transactions are actually available. And I always recommend in Dynatrace, right, if you have Dynatrace and synthetic, use the built-in stuff, or if you have any other synthetic tools, obviously make sure to leverage them. And with Dynatrace, you can see here, you can execute and define these tests either through a visual recording mode, or even through what we call Monaco, monitoring as code. That means you can define these tests in your Git repository next to your source code, and then just push it out as part of your deployment. So let me quickly walk over and show you also something on my end. Here we go. So this is Dynatrace, just a little best practice, what I always do with my workshops. I'm sure if you have seen some of my other videos, then I'm sure you have come across my different environments where I use the same app, but running it multi-tenancy wise, and every workshop attendee typically gets assigned to one of these instances, and these instances have a unique name, and I just used the top stock symbols I found. Like in this case, this is my synthetic test for my application that runs for Apple, or I have Acer and others as well, right? If I go here, I have all of this stuff running here. So what I want to show you is Dynatrace synthetic tests for me are really powerful, because you can set them up, as I said, either by recording, just clicking through your browser, clicking through the key features, and then let Dynatrace synthetic execute these steps that you just recorded on a regular basis. You can also specify from where you want to execute them. We also have support for what we call private locations. That means you can also run it from within your own network if that's of a concern for you. But you get your performance, you get your availability, you have multiple steps, you even have scripting capabilities. So it's really powerful. One big, let's say, tip, again, if you will end up most likely using synthetic a lot for different services, do me a favor, just do good tagging. So you can always tag these synthetic tests, like I have my delivery demo. This is a production test, meaning a synthetic test against my production environment for a particular app or service. So use tags, which is really good. Also, we have a new feature called on-demand execution. So you can on-demand execute the synthetic test, not only on a scheduled basis, but on demand, which allows you at any time to kick it off, figure out, is the system yet available, currently available, does it work? And you can also integrate this into your delivery pipeline, because we also have API calls to trigger the on-demand execution. So really important. A lot of metrics that we have here, and you can see here, you have different options to then go also into analysis screens and figure out what's happening over time, right? But I guess synthetic test against, great for availability testing. So let's go back. This is the first tip. Next tip is explain the terminology, right? If you have agreed on a certain SLO that you want to specify, like availability or success rate, also make sure that everybody understands what it actually means, because everything starts actually with an SLI, a service level indicator, which is the metric that defines the health of a particular service. And technically it means the number of good events divided by the valid events. To give you an example, it would be, for instance, for request success rate, the number of HTTP requests, let's say, that come back with an HTTP status 200, divided by the total number of requests. So let's assume in a time frame of, let's say, an hour, you have 1,000 requests coming in from your real users. 900 of those are successful in terms of returning an HTTP status 200. It would be 900 divided by 1,000 is 0.9, multiplied by 100, because we want to always normalize it into a percentage, into a rate metric. This is what you have. In Dynatrace, in the SLO wizard, which I'll walk you through later on, you can do the same thing. We give you some presets, but also the full power of defining any type of expression that you can then use to actually come up with a rate metric. So you can do your divisions, you can do everything. So SLI is the metric itself that is an indicator of, are we good or are we no good? How many requests do we have that are good versus no good? Now, SLO is then the objective. It's a target that you have against your SLI. So for instance, you could say in 99.98% of the requests, they should be successful. So that's your target. And in Dynatrace, again, you can set this as well. As you're walking through the wizard, you can specify the target, but you can also specify a warning range, which we not only show visually, but you can also alert on. And then last thing, and I think this is extremely powerful, is please explain the terminology and the content of an error budget. To explain it quickly, if you specify an SLO like 99.90, the error budget means you have 0.10%, which means if you're agreeing that your system is healthy 99.90, it can be unhealthy 0.10% over the reporting period. Now, this is actually not a whole lot if you think about it, right? 0.10%, if your reporting period is 30 days times 24 hours per day times 60 minutes per hour, this only gives you 43.2 minutes of overall not being healthy. And that's kind of your error budget over your reporting period. Now, why is this important? Well, it is important because you always want to know how are you doing in terms of the error budget, because at any point in time during your reporting period, you want to know, are you still on track? Yes or no. So if it's the 10th of the month and you're still good because none of your error budget has been used, it's a feel good situation. If you have already consumed a lot of your errors, or your error budget, then you know it's going to be really tight, and then you may need to make certain actions. Also very important is that you can use the available error budget to make better decisions. If you have a new deployment coming in and you say, hey, we know every time we have a new feature that we roll out, every time we need to roll out a new version, we have a certain downtime, just part of your deployment process. And then you can actually make the decision, do you still have enough error budget left to push out a new feature or not? And this is also a great indicator or a great additional point to making better decisions. So you can also ask the business, you can say, here's a new feature, but we already consumed all of our error budget. What's more important for you, the new feature or the high probability that we are violating our SLO at the end? Now, another big thing is the so-called burn down rate. So if you start with the 0.10 at the beginning of the month, every time you have a problem, you're kind of burning down. And the burn down rate is kind of the steepness of the curve. And the steepness of the curve basically says, how fast are you burning? Right? And this is something that you will see also later on that we can also use to alert on, because you don't want to react on every single little blip, but what you want to react on is if there's a problem going on right now that is consuming and eating too fast to your error budget, then you want to alert on. And the analogy that I have here for you, if you are a marathon runner and 1 mile before the finish line, you realize that for the last 10 miles, you were too slow, but now there's no way to catch up anymore because you're not reaching a goal, it's too late. But if you already know at mile number 2 or 3 that you are too slow, far too slow, then you can take an action that in the end will bring you over the finish line in time. And this is kind of the same thing with the error budget burn down rate. It alerts you if you're currently on the wrong trajectory. It's really the steepness of the curve. All right. So demo and tip, once you specify the SLOs, also put them on the dashboards like this. I've shown this in many of my previous videos. So what I will show is just going into my dashboard here. First of all, SLOs in Dynatrace itself, right? On the menu on the left, you can search for SLO, service level objectives. It gets you exactly to this particular screen. What else do we have here? This screen is obviously filterable by the management zones. So if you have a lot of SLOs, every team will get to see their SLOs depending on who they are, right? I mean, depending on the management zone definition. So let me go back to Apple, for instance. It's the one I had earlier. Here we go. So these are the ones I have already. I can expand them and I can see, it seems like pretty solid what they're based on, but I really want to also show you how to create a new one. So add new SLO. This is the wizard that we've also covered in previous observability clinics, but just a quick reminder. First of all, we give you 5 presets, kind of best practice SLOs: service level availability, service method availability, user experience, mobile crash-free users, and synthetic availability. Right? And synthetic availability is actually the one that I like a lot because it's based on the synthetic test. Remember the one that I've shown you earlier. Now, just again, a quick reminder, what these presets do, and you can maybe spot it on the bottom, it really just defaults then to a metrics expression that is always then returning a metric between 0 and 100, a rate metric. Now you can use the presets, like the first one is service level availability, the number of successful requests divided by the total number. That's the example I had in my slides. You can use any of the others, like synthetic availability. This metric in Dynatrace is already by default the rate metric, so I only need that. But you can do everything here. It's a full expression. You can use whatever you like. Let's do availability. And I said my availability SLO for AAPL. Give it a good rate, right? It's a success rate based on synthetic availability. Give it a good name, and depending on the name, you then also get from Dynatrace an additional metric, like from the SLO itself, the rate metric, plus we also get the burn down rate metric, which we can later also use for alerting. So this is kind of the first section, select your indicator. The second section is define the filter, because as you probably know, there's 2 things. We need a time frame and also on which entity we want to apply this to, because I may have 1, I may have 10, I may have 1,000 different synthetic tests or services. So I need to be very specific. What's the default time frame, and also what's the entity selector? That's what we call it in Dynatrace. And you can see here, I have the 1 browser check, but I could, right? If you remember earlier, I had a tag on it as well on my synthetic test. So I can also be more specific and then click on preview and I see it's still this one, but specify what entity you want to do it on. So let me do this, and then success criteria. This is where the success criteria comes in. Remember the SLO, the target. I do something like this. I can also say error budget burn down rate. I want to have this, click on evaluate. I get an overview of how this looks like, because this is a great validation. If I really specified the right query that gives me a value between 0 and 100, what the value ranges are, and then I can click on create. And now I have it. And now I can, watch it again, look at it here. I can from here put it on the chart, pin it on the dashboard, change the definition, clone it, or also create an alert based on it. And one thing that I really like to build, and this is kind of like to finish my demo on this one, I really like to build dashboards like this, where I have, for instance, an availability SLO, the one I just created, a performance-based SLO, meaning in this case, I have an SLO that measures the number of requests that are faster than 500 milliseconds and divides it by the total number. And I have an SLO on this, so I have a last hour, last 24 hours, last 7 days, and then I also have an overview of the last 30 days. So this is just a regular dashboard. And these are all so-called SLO tiles. And you can see here, this one always shows the same SLO, availability of AAPL, but I just overwrite the time frame. And then here I just chart the metric itself. Right? Now, it's up to you what you want to put on a dashboard, but I thought this was always a really good one to build. Okay, great. And also, tagging is also very important. Good. Now let's go back to my slides. So tip number 3. Tip number 4, leverage the alerting options. So not only do you have this for dashboarding, but you can also create alerts, alert on status. So give me an alert in case I'm no longer green, but I'm yellow or red, or also on the burn down rate. And the last thing, what's also really nice, this is a visual indicator. This actually says, hey, this SLO is currently associated with an ongoing problem that the Dynatrace Davis EI detected. And this is what I meant in the very beginning. If you have 10 problems currently in your environment, you probably want to focus on those, at least from my perspective, that actually has a potential impact on the SLO. Right? This is like, this SLO here is at risk because there's a problem that Dynatrace is currently tracking in your end-to-end environment that supports this particular SLO. And how do we know all this? Because the SLO is assigned and defined against a certain entity. And then we have all the dependency model, our Smartscape. And so we know if there's any problem in anywhere along that end-to-end dependency tree, it potentially puts this SLO at risk. Good. Last part, scaling SLOs. And I'm sure you have heard me talk about this, but if you don't shift left SLOs, I think you will fail to transform your organization for sure. Now, what does this really mean? SLOs are great, as I said, but if you only specify them somewhere in one team and you're not breaking it down like we did earlier with my example from the mobile app, from a top level SLO down to technical metrics and actually assign ownership to it, if you don't do this, you will just compete with other objectives that may not in the end result in your objective to be met, right? Because development typically is pressured on more features and more releases. And if what they are doing is not aligned with your business objectives and they're not looking and ensuring the right quality, then you have a problem. So the solution is Dynatrace helps you shifting left SLOs, which means, first of all, I've already shown you how you define SLOs in production, how you can put them on a dashboard, how you can become proactive by also seeing when SLOs are getting violated, or even before they get violated, if there's a problem, and then you can react to it. So you can even kind of eliminate any SLO impact if you act fast. But then we want to shift left, meaning you want to also watch out for your SLOs as part of your releases. So as part of your release validation, here I will show you how you can use SLOs and additional metrics, leading indicators, security metrics in the decision on whether release is good or not. And this is really what I like about this, call it SLOs for DevOps, SLOs for your pipelines, SLOs for release validation. And then we can shift all the way left, because I think in the end, you want to make sure that also your developers in their day-to-day business, when they're checking in code and their pipelines run, that every time a pipeline runs, certain tests are executed, but also key SLOs and key level indicators are measured and validated. Okay? All right. So the tip is, I'm sure you have hopefully already have some type of tools that are helping you to deploy into an environment, and whatever tool that is, and I will show you a demo with Azure DevOps, can be Jenkins, can be GitLab, can be anything. You want to make sure that you are triggering Dynatrace's cloud automation capabilities to automatically validate a new build that you just deployed into a production or pre-production environment based on not only one SLO, but on many SLOs, also leading additional technical indicators. So we call it release scoring. And this score is then automatically pushed back into the pipeline that you have. And I want to quickly show you this as well. So let me go to my other environment that I have here. So here's an environment, and this is a dashboard. I'm sure you have heard about our sample app, Easy Travel. So Easy Travel is a great app. And every time you have a new feature or a new version of Easy Travel being deployed, we're monitoring it, obviously. But also one of our, let's say, release engineers or responsible architects has specified a dashboard that he would normally look at, because after every deployment, he is looking at things like what's the response time of the individual features, search, calculate recommendations, login. So here is a dashboard or a chart that shows response time based on critical endpoints, error count, throughput, CPU time. So think about it. You typically build a dashboard where you would normally manually look at and say, this is what I would look at if I get a new release, and then I make an assessment if it's a good or not a good release. Now, what we allow you to do is not only create this dashboard, but we allow you, now I'm coming quickly over to Azure DevOps, from your environment, from your delivery tool, right? Like in my case here, I have every hour, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 o'clock, my pipeline is kicking off a new build. And in that build, what it actually does, in staging, it actually reaches out to Dynatrace and says, Dynatrace, I have a new build, but now I want you to validate it. And this is where I come over to cloud automation now. So what happens here is Azure DevOps, right? This was the release 7835. This comes from Microsoft Visual Studio, build ID, blah, 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 right? This one actually triggered what we call an automation sequence. And that sequence was validating if the build that was just deployed is actually good or no good. And this is what you see here now. Every line here represents one of the charts and metrics on the dashboard. So instead of whoever it is needing, after a deployment, manually analyzing this dashboard for that particular time frame of the current deployment and having to give a manual thumbs up or thumbs down, Dynatrace Cloud Automation automatically evaluates every metric on the dashboard, scores it, and then comes up with a total score. And it goes beyond that, because just analyzing some metrics after a deployment might not be good enough, because if you are, let's say, deploying into a pre-prod environment and you don't have any load on it, then what good does it do? So our cloud automation goes further than that. You can actually specify so-called, and I think I mentioned it, delivery sequences or sequences of tasks. And the sequence of tasks that is triggered by my Azure DevOps starts actually with a test where Dynatrace orchestrates the test execution. So it calls and triggers your testing tool of choice, and then is triggering the evaluation. The point here is, though, we are packaging it up and we're giving it to you as part of a release validation. So you can say, I have a new release, Dynatrace, I want you to evaluate. And I want you to evaluate in a way that you are executing some tests, maybe executing, remember, the synthetic tests on demand from Dynatrace, even if you don't have your own test tools, and then evaluate the quality and then give me back result on whether this is a good build or not a good build. Now, this goes much beyond what this is, but this is a typical use case that people get started with. But we are also able to do full end-to-end orchestration of your deployments. We can do post-deployment checks, pre-deployment, post-deployment checks. We can orchestrate across multiple stages and integrate with any of your tools. But the point that I wanted to make is that we can help you automate the validation of your SLOs as part of your delivery pipeline. And with this, you ensure that whatever ends up in production is not going to violate your key metrics, your key SLOs. So If you want to learn more, there's a lot of other material out there. If you're completely new to SLOs, there's a great one called Getting Started with SLOs with Brian Chandler. Then another one, Automating SLO Best Practices using Dynatrace in Monaco. So really creating SLOs at scale, fully automated as code. This was done with Arishan. And then I had Rob recently on a clinic, and we called it Getting Started with Observability-Driven DevOps and SRE. There, we also start with SLOs, but then we go and show the broad, the full scope of using SLOs to strategically orchestrate your delivery and also orchestrate your auto remediation in production, so that whatever happens in your environment is always green based on your SLOs. All right, with this, thank you so much. Hopefully this was a little inspiring and you learned something new, and you see also that Dynatrace is there to help you getting started with your SLO journey and scale it. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.